tasks. I'll be reviewing some of the most prominent bias mitigation techniques and pointing out some of the issues with their evaluation paradigm. Yeah, so let's get started. So let me start off with this big picture of deep learning evolution. So this is a very commonly used chart showing how the error rate on this ImageNet benchmark has been going down over the number of years. Since 2016, it has actually gone below the human error rate, showing superhuman performance. And really, the field of computer vision has been revolutionized by deep learning techniques. So application areas including face recognition to image stacking, where the algorithm is supposed to annotate different parts of the images, to even autonomous vehicles. These systems use deep learning for computer vision. But once in a while, we get these kinds of news with so concerning problems about these systems. So this one was an article about Google's image tagging algorithm, which was biased against Black people, tagging them as gorillas, which is really concerning. Likewise, there was just another article about Twitter's image cropping tool, which also was biased against Black people. So it favored cropping white faces over Black ones. And likewise, the language tasks also use deep learning, right? So tasks such as machine translation to summarizing text so that it's easier for us to consume. All of them have been using deep learning. And there are these larger models, larger systems such as GPT-3, which are trained on very large corpuses of data, and they are able to produce results that look kind of intelligent. So like they are able to generate articles that otherwise look like they were written by some human. And this particular system has many use cases, like it can generate source code, it can be used in chatbots, it can create fiction, prepare your resume, and so on and so forth. But again, even for seemingly intelligent GPT-3, it suffers from dataset biases. So these are some of the tweets tweeted by GPT-3. And the first one is biased against women. So it says women always have to ask for directions. The second tweet is biased against the Jewish community, like saying Holocaust would make so much environmental sense. So again, really concerning things. And really, while the hope of AI is to create these systems with human-like understanding, and in many of the tasks, it even outperforms humans, the reality really is that they exploit these dataset biases and therefore can lead to really embarrassing results like we just saw. And it's really doubtful if they have actually learned to solve the tasks. Now, for the rest of the talk, I'll mainly be focusing on this particular vision and language task called visual question answering, mainly because it entails both visual understanding and linguistic skills. Let me just introduce this first. So the task is about answering questions about images. So given an image and a question about it, the system is supposed to predict the correct answer. We've been using this quite often in our lab because it has been dubbed to be a Turing test for AI. It requires many different vision and language skills, such as object and attribute recognition, to understanding sentiments expressed in the image, to things like compositional reasoning, like this is a fairly complicated question, like what are the red fruits to the left of the glass of juice? Requires the algorithm to first locate the juice, the glass of juice, and then look towards its left to locate the object that is red. and also overall scene understanding. So it requires a lot of different skills. But like any other data set, it also contains these statistical data set patterns, which gives rise to data set biases. So for instance, strawberries naturally are usually red, and there are very few strawberries that are differently colored. Now for a VQA system, given an image of a yellow strawberry, and if we ask what color is the strawberry, ideally we want the system to use the signal, right? So we want the system to focus on the actual image, the object of interest, look at its color, and then produce the answer. But then there are these other spurious correlations, like strawberries mostly being red, and the systems may just start to exploit them and predict all of the strawberries as being red. So that's bias. Now, previously in VQA datasets, this issue was even, this issue really came up because the train and test distributions were very similar. So for instance, in the training set, strawberries would be naturally mostly red, but the same distribution was also used in the test set. So red being the most common color for strawberries in the test set as well. Now what this did was allow some of the algorithms to simply exploit this distribution. So just predict red as being color for strawberry and still get pretty good performance on the test set. So this particular one is an example of a question-only model, which means this particular system does not even look at the image, just reads the question and predicts its answer. But on this particular benchmark, since the training and test distributions are similar, it produces pretty high results because it gets to exploit the dataset bias. So there was this another dataset called VQSCP, CP standing for changing priors, that was proposed. And it had different biases in the train and test sets. So for instance, now the test set might have yellow as the most common answer for strawberry instead of red. And so the algorithms which otherwise relied on these biases now fail on this test set. So they produce pretty large drop, like 24% accuracy drop for a particular baseline that's very, very popularly used for VQA. Yeah, so they show a lack of resistance to biases. So many bias mitigation algorithms were proposed, and there really are a lot of them. I just divided them into a bunch of families, but of course for this talk, I won't be able to go through all of them. So instead, I broadly categorized these techniques into two categories. The first of which is the class of techniques that focus on difficult samples. So again, going back to our strawberry example, these can be trained to focus more on rarer colors like yellow or purple strawberries more than the red strawberries. Likewise, there's another class of techniques which are trained to focus on the relevant parts of the input itself. So again, for the strawberry example, for instance, we can have models which are trained to look at the strawberry and only then predict the answer. So just look at the part of the input that you should be looking at. So let me start off with the first category of techniques, which are trained to focus more on the difficult samples. Before that, let me just go through a typical visual question answering model. So given an image and a question, a typical VQA model has a visual encoder and a question encoder. They produce their own embeddings, some sort of representations. And there's this classifier which takes in both of the modalities and then produces its prediction. As you can see, there's no specific bias mitigation mechanism here. So I'll talk about that now. So one way to add a bias mitigation mechanism is this ensembling mechanism, where we introduce one another model. I'm calling it as a bias-only model because it performs the task by only using bias. So for our VQCP dataset, the question representation contains biases. So it just uses the question, does not look at the image, and tries to guess the answer. Now, we can use this particular bias-only model to now debias the main model. So let's see how the bias-only model does for an easy sample. So let's say we provided an instance about red strawberries, or ask a question about red strawberries. So for this particular instance, since the biased answer, that is red, happens to be the ground truth answer, it does pretty well for this particular question about this particular image. So what we can do is, for these kinds of easy samples or bias-prone samples, we can use this bias-only model to weigh the main model. So we can weigh such samples lower so that they would affect less during training. Likewise, for difficult samples, let's say for yellow strawberry, the bias-only model will not perform well, right? So because the answer is not one of those answers that frequently occurs in the data set. So we can use that information to then provide a higher weight to such samples so that the main model now starts learn to generalize to these kinds of rare instances as well. So that's how ensembling mechanism works. And it's a pretty popular mechanism used in both vision and language tasks. I'll talk about one more algorithm, which is very popular. So it follows a similar setup. So has a main model and bias only model. But instead of weighing the samples, now what we can do is penalize the main model whenever the bias only model does well. So we do this by adversarial regularization, which means during the course of training, the gradients during backpropagation are simply reversed. So if the bias only model does well, which means if the representations provided by the main model to the bias only model are biased, then the main model is penalized. So this kind of helps the main model to not learn biased representations. And all in all, for the VQCP dataset I mentioned, these methods outperform the baseline. And both of these are pretty common, like I said, for both vision and language tasks. But of course, the underlying assumption here is that we can first of all identify the source of bias. So for VQCP, it was the question representations. And then we can somehow inject that information into the model for these methods to work. Now let me switch to another category of methods which are designed to focus more on the actual parts of the input that it should be using to perform the task. So for visual question answering, it's pretty simple, right? So for this particular question, we basically want the VQA model to focus on the strawberry itself and not the other objects. So assuming that we have such annotations, like we can get these from attention maps from humans, or there are some other techniques as well. Assuming we have that information about where the models would be looking at, we can then train the model to look at those reasons. So let me just elaborate that. So firstly, we can assign ground truth scores to all of these visual reasons. So for our question, we want the model to look at the strawberry, so it gets a ground truth score of 1. Other visual reasons get a ground truth score of 0. Now, during the course of training, maybe the model is mistaken. Maybe it's looking at some other objects instead of the actual object. So using that ground truth score, we can then correct that and have the model also look at the reasons it should be looking at. So that's the main idea behind this class of techniques, and I'm calling them visual grounding techniques. These methods bring pretty large improvements, as shown by the chart here. And this kind of makes sense, right? So we're basically telling the model to use the parts of the input that actually will help it solve the task. So of course it would help. But are they really working for the right reasons? To answer this question, we conducted a case study, and it was published in the ACL last year. And I'll go through that now. So to answer the question whether or not they were actually working for the right reasons, we decided to conduct this sanity test. So the test basically asks this question: what happens if instead of looking at the relevant visual reasons that it should be looking at, we look at some other irrelevant reasons that has nothing to do with predicting answer for the given question? Obviously, it should fail, right? Well, surprisingly, we found that both these systems, so the previous one that looked at relevant reasons and this one, which does not look at relevant reasons, produce very similar accuracy gains, which is very surprising. In fact, when we conducted statistical tests between these approaches, the one with looking at relevant and the other one looking at irrelevant reasons, the results weren't statistically significant. So why did the performance really improve then? So to answer this question, we looked at how it behaves on the training dataset. So HINT and SCR are two different state-of-the-art visual grounding methods that work pretty similarly. But on the training set, as you can see, as the training progresses, it actually degrades the training accuracy. And this kind of explains why it gains, why it improves things on the test set of VQSVP. So the explanation is that degrading accuracy on the training set helps it forget those biases. So for our strawberry example, it kind of forgets that strawberries are usually red. Now this in turn helps the test set because in the test set, the biases are different. Maybe the strawberries are of different color. Now, of course, a robust model, a truly intelligent model wouldn't need to have done this. It shouldn't have decreased training accuracy to increase test accuracy. That's just bizarre. So yeah, in summary, just observing some improvement on test set does not mean that the method is actually working for the right reasons. So concerned by this study, we conducted another study. This was published in NeurIPS 2020 and was led by Damien from University of Adelaide. So in this study, we analyzed a broader range of bias mitigation methods and not just the visual grounding methods that we just saw. Specifically, we wanted to check if these methods were behaving in accordance to Goodhart's law. So Goodhart's law states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So for our case, this VQACP had become a measure for measuring bias resistance in VQA algorithms. But now, since all the people were just using it as a target, that is just trying to get higher numbers in that particular data set, had it just ceased to be a good measure of bias resistance. And we found that to be the case. So essentially, we took like 10 different algorithms. I'm only showing a few ones that I already discussed here, but all of them were suffering from these issues. So essentially, they were just hacking the VQCP dataset. So they were exploiting this information about how the test set of VQCP was constructed, how the distribution shift was done um, for the test set, and then exploiting that to gain accuracy on the data set. In fact, they were even tuned on the test set itself, which is like a big no for any scientific method, really. Apart from that, for these methods, they would either work on training distribution or test distribution, but not both. So in the blue, I'm showing a validation set for VQACP, accuracy on the validation set, which is basically follows the training distribution. And in the red, it shows accuracy on VQACP test set, which is different from training distribution. As you can see if the accuracy on in distribution or training distribution is high, then accuracy on test distribution is low, and vice versa. So if it's high on test, it's low on train. Yeah. In fact, it was pretty easy to hack VQACP. We presented some silly baselines, such as simply sampling random answers from an inverted distribution, inverted with respect to the training set. And it also produced very large gains in accuracy on certain question types. Likewise, there was another baseline that simply masked out the highest predicted answer. And just by removing the answer it was most confident on, it again yielded a high gain on the test set. And like we saw before, just regularizing on random or irrelevant visual features actually produced state-of-the-art results. So yeah, just blindly optimizing for a single metric like an accuracy on a data set like VQACP is really not a recipe for success. So what we really need are benchmarks that are harder to hack. This can be done by introducing different types of biases, which vary in different levels in the data set. The other lesson is, of course, don't rely on a single metric. Instead, we should be using metrics that are computed on a range of settings, and we should see if the methods can generalize to different levels and types of biases. And finally, even if there is improvement on certain test sets, we should be careful to actually identify why the gains occurred. So just because there is some gain on a test set does not mean that the system is behaving intelligently. So taking all of these into account, we conducted an evaluation, a more comprehensive evaluation, and this work is still under review. But we took a broad range of bias mitigation techniques and asked several critical questions about their robustness. The very first issue with these techniques is that almost all of them have only been tested against a single bias source. So this is a sample data set that's very commonly used. It's called celeb A. Here, the task is to predict hair color of these celebrities, but blonde-haired male celebrities are very rare in the data set. So the model learns the shortcut that males are dark-haired because it's a very rare group. And baseline methods tend to fail on this particular group. So this is the overall accuracy on the entire data set. And this is the accuracy on only the blonde-haired male celebrities. And it's much lower. So the bias mitigation techniques use this problem, and then um, they report, they do different things. I've already talked about some of the techniques, and they report pretty large gains on this particular data set. But again, this particular data set is only considering gender as a bias variable. It only has one source of bias. Likewise, there's this another data set called color dimness. So here the task is to predict the class of the digit, but it is spuriously correlated with color of the digit. So zeros are mostly red, ones are mostly green, and twos are mostly yellow. So, baseline algorithms, instead of learning to recognize the shape, might just use color to guess the class of the digit. And again, bias mitigation methods use this data set and show improvements over baselines. So baseline is pretty low, and these methods show pretty large gains over the baseline. But again, this is only one source of bias. So the only source of bias here is the color of the digit. Right, so the natural question is, what if there are more than one source of bias? So in our work, we proposed this biased and mixed dataset, which allows us to test against multiple sources of bias. So just like color dimness, the task is again to classify the digit in the image. So here are ones and twos. But each digit is correlated, spuriously correlated with multiple other variables. So ones are mostly green. Likewise, the background color may be a source of bias, with ones mostly being presented on a purple background. Likewise, these distracting shapes, so ones mostly co-occur with triangles that are orange in color. Yeah, and so on and so forth, like other things like texture and the color of the texture. All in all, there are 7 different bias variables, all of which are correlated with the target digit. Of course, the test set is balanced out, so every digit can have any color, can be associated with any other co-occurring shape. And this helps us really test whether or not these methods can deal with multiple sources of biases. Well, what we found was again very concerning. So in the blue, I'm showing results from a baseline method which does not have any bias mitigation mechanism. And it outperforms the best state-of-the-art method that we found on that particular data set. So this was for a toy data set. We also did it for a more natural, realistic benchmark. Of course, the benchmark that's most commonly used is again VQSAP, which really measures generalization to question type versus answer imbalances. So like given a particular question type, like color questions, there is imbalance in the answer distribution, and that's what it measures. But this wasn't sufficient for our case. In fact, there's this one data set called GQA OOD, out of distribution, that goes beyond VQSCP. Apart from just question type and answer distribution, it also considers the main concept the question is concerned about. So like instead of just saying what's the answer distribution for color questions, it would be more specific. Like what's the answer distribution for colors of shirts or colors of strawberries. So it just has more fine-grained annotations that we can use to measure robustness. What we found was again very similar to what had happened for biased MNIST. Again, the baseline method without any bias mitigation mechanism outperformed state-of-the-art methods that took in explicit knowledge about what the bias variables were. Yeah, so this was common between both biased MNIST and GQA-OOD. Now, this kind of test also allowed us to answer some other questions, like what if some of the bias variables were hidden, right? So for the previous examples, like for biased MNIST, the techniques we used, we labeled all of the 7 bias variables and provided those labels to the method so that they would be robust to all of these bias variables. But what if we were not able to identify or we were not able to label those bias variables? What would happen? So to answer that question, we decided to hide certain bias variables. So in this chart, in the x-axis, I'm showing the number of bias variables that were hidden from the methods. So the first column is really the old previous result where none of the bias variables were hidden, as in all of the labels were specified for the methods. And gradually we started to hide some of the variables. But as you can see, the performance was pretty similar no matter what we did. So even if we hid some of the variables or we provided all of the variables, they just failed. The state-of-the-art methods were well below the baseline. There was one surprising finding, though. So if we showed only one variable, so if we hid all of the variables but one, there was some improvement and it reached closer to the baseline, even though it stayed below the baseline. So it clearly shows that these methods have not been able to deal with these multiple sources of biases, even if they are annotated. But so this particular result, where only one particular variable was provided to the method, was doing pretty well. So this naturally led to another question. So what if we did not have any labels about bias variables, right? So, I mean, in practice, identifying and annotating all of these sources of biases could be expensive and is really undesirable to us to actually have to annotate everything. So it's much more desirable to have methods that can identify and correct their own biases. This line of thought has recently been gaining some traction. So one popular way to do this is to have what's called an implicit bias detector. So for this, what one can do is identify easy or bias-prone samples, such as the red strawberry example. We can identify them if we train a model for very few epochs, or if we reduce the model size, or if we have some loss functions that can actually amplify these biases. So previously, we used to have labels for each of the samples to say what the bias are. Now it can identify such samples, such bias-prone samples by itself. And again, we can use this detector to then debias the main model. For instance, by simply downweighting the bias-prone samples and upweighting the samples that are more difficult, that are rarer in the dataset. This actually had pretty promising results for our tests. So for bias enlist, it outperformed baseline and the explicit methods I was talking about by a large margin. And we observed similar things for this visual question answering benchmark as well. So this is a pretty promising sign for methods that can detect their own biases and then start to mitigate them as well. So I'm inching towards the end of the talk. Would just like to introduce this another promising direction, which looks at bias, the problem of dataset bias from a causal perspective. So these kinds of methods usually employ what are called as counterfactuals. So basically, these kinds of samples are created by editing the causal factors of the instance so that the outcomes are different. I'll explain more. So let's say for this particular example, the question is asking about the color of tie. What we can do is then hide the tie, and then the model shouldn't be able to answer if it's green or not, right? So this would be a visual counterfactual. It's editing the causal factor, which is the tie itself, and it's supposed to produce some other outcome, which means we shouldn't be able to predict its color. Likewise, we can edit the question as well to produce counterfactual examples. So let's say we mask off the word tie from the question. Then again, we would expect the model to not be able to produce the actual answer. Yeah, so that's the main idea behind counterfactuals. So yeah, I'm at the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening in. As closing thoughts, I just wanted to say that we have tons of these bias mitigation methods, but their actual robustness in practice is still very much questionable. And really, like, even if they are showing gains on certain data sets, we probably shouldn't trust them to do well in like real life. Yeah, thank you so much, and would be happy to take any questions.